Okay, Jack, why don't you start us off?
All right, great. Well, good morning. My name is Jack McDougall, and I'm the president and CEO of the Greater Washington Board of Trade. I want to welcome everyone to our regional policy leadership series presented this week by Holland and Knight. The series is also supported by Comcast, GS Proctor and Associates, McGuire Woods Consulting, and McGuire Woods. Today we're facing significant disruptions across multiple areas, including inflation, economic growth, and uncertainty, transportation, energy and climate, education and talent, health and wellness, technology, crime, and so much more. Business leaders describe this as the most disruptive period they've ever experienced. So that's saying something. So to help us sort through all of this and these many issues from a policy perspective, we're very honored to be joined by DC Council Chairman Phil Mendelson. Phil was first elected as an at-large council member in 1998. And in 2012, his colleagues selected him to be the chairman, and he has served in that role since. Chairman Mendelson is joined by Janine Jackson, a partner in Holland and Knight's Public Policy and Regulation Group. She utilizes her extensive experience to help clients navigate the legislative and regulatory aspects of local government. I can't think of anyone better to moderate our discussion this morning. As we go through this, if anyone has any questions, please come through the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to those at the end. So I want to thank you, Chairman Mendelson and Janine, for taking time to be with us this morning and share your insights on the many complicated and major issues impacting the district. So Janine, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. And thank you, everyone at the Board of Trade. It's an honor to be here today. And more importantly, it's an honor to talk to my favorite chairman, my favorite boss ever in the world. You don't know, I used to work for Phil Mendelson when he was just the at-large member, and he chaired the Committee on Public Safety and the Judiciary. So good morning, Mr. Chairman. How are you?
I'm fine. Good morning. And thank you, Janine.
Don't you want to say I was your favorite staffer ever?
You were my favorite staffer ever. And I remember long days over the weekend going over criminal code issues where you were teaching me a thing or two.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but I'll accept that. I'll accept that. So today, Mr. Chairman, we're going to have an extensive far and wide conversation. We're going to talk about the future workforce, transportation, digital transformation, DEI, and improving the business climate in the District of Columbia. And because this is a regional policy series, you could certainly, contextualize your answers about the district, but also put it in the context of how the district impacts the region. That would be great, because, I think that's really important. We are a connected jurisdiction, and, many of the things that happen in DC, impact Maryland, impact Virginia, and vice versa. So why don't we start off with the future workforce? As you know, companies across the region are struggling to fill positions at all levels. We know that we have police officers, police departments that need more officers, hospitals that need more nurses, schools that need teachers, and so on. Can you talk to us about what the council is doing to address these current shortfalls?
Well, I'm not going to say that we're doing enough or that we are doing or that we have the right answers. For this year's budget, we put about $20 million in for new special initiatives that are trying to help with job training and filling some of these hard to fill positions. We've come to increasingly use the University of the District of Columbia for some workforce training programs, such as for teachers and social workers and IT. We put money in, some additional money in the Department of Employment Services to fund the Infrastructure Academy, money into WIC for the Career Coaches Initiative. I mentioned, when I mentioned UDC, I left out nurses. There's another program called Career Pathways. There are a number of different initiatives. I'm not going to say every one of them is great. I'm not saying we're putting enough money into them. Maybe there's some that we should be putting more money in, and others we should be putting less money in. My view is that the council really needs to rely on hearing from stakeholders to understand what are the most effective strategies. But the short answer is we recognized the problem and we put some money into initiatives to try to help.
Thank you, sir. And one of the things you worked on during the height of the pandemic were educational gaps and, virtual and learning loss during that virtual period. Can you tell us about those efforts and sort of, clearly how they're going to lead to helping companies, what you hope is that there'll be jobs on the other end and that students will be able to make up the difference in their experience. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you did during the pandemic?
Yeah, let me start this way. We talk about job training and we look at the Department of Employment Services or the WIC or even UDC with regard to job training. And all that makes sense, but some of what I just said was education is job training, and public education is actually the best job training program there is, because that's really what sets the foundation. We have several $100 million in federal money to help overcome learning loss. This is all part of the ARPA Act and the CARES Act. And I have to say that I'm disappointed that that money hasn't gotten out the door quickly enough. As of a few weeks ago, I believe less than a third of the money had been spent. And I don't know, I'm not going to convey optimism that all that money is going to be used as quickly or as effectively as it should be. I'm sounding somewhat critical of the government. Yeah, I am a bit critical because I think we throw money into a lot of programs that don't always have the follow through or are as maybe the most effective way to go about. I've been focused on how we improve public education at the K through 12 level. That's a long-term strategy, not a short-term strategy in terms of job training. But as I said before, if kids graduate from high school with a high school diploma that really means something, that they're literate and so forth, then they're positioned to go into the workforce or go on to higher education and go into the workforce. So that's where I've been focused, is reducing teacher turnover, principal turnover, more budget stability in the schools themselves, avoiding getting into the governance fight, which I think is a complete distraction, trying to increase attendance, and pressing through oversight, more intensive work on the part of educators to improve literacy.
All right, sir. So one of the other things that you addressed during the pandemic was the digital divide and the concern about students. Can you tell us how the District of Columbia is working to ensure that, DC remains on the forefront of technology or technological advances and, hoping to prevent the digital divide for some of its residents?
Well, I have to be honest, this is not my strongest issue in terms of all the issues I deal with in the council. Again, I'm not sure that the government is doing enough. I think that we need to provide broadband access at affordable levels to all residents. I'm supportive of the idea of trying to create, I forget exactly what it's called, but in the public space, access to Wi-Fi, and also supporting our Office of the Chief Technology Officer with regard to how to protect the district. And that's not just the government, but everybody in the district, from issues with cybersecurity. So supportive of initiatives that expand access. And what we saw with the pandemic was, in particular with education, that because remote schools were remote teaching or remote learning, that access to the internet was critical, and it was quite obvious very quickly that there was a digital divide and we need to close that.
All right, sir. Well, one of the other things that's impacting the region is transportation. And you have served in COG for numerous years. And we know that, Greater Washington anticipates adding 1.5 million people over the next 20 years. And growth of that size is going to put significant stress on an already overburdened transit system. And we need those transportation, that particular for district residents, since we, most of our residents work outside of the District of Columbia. So can you tell us why transit is critical to keeping us connected, and discuss with us sort of additional funding for WMATA. And do you expect to continue to support WMATA, and what other steps DC might take to improve the transit networks?
Well, there was a lot in that question. With regard to WMATA, the council has been, and I have been very supportive of WMATA. I worked with regional leaders 4 or 5 years ago to set up the Metro Rail Safety Commission. I'm concerned right now that there's been some tension between the Safety Commission and the WMATA board. The two need to work together instead of what appears to be a bit of a gotcha from one side or the other. I'm not quite sure who, but in any event, supportive of the Metro Rail Safety Commission. I was very much involved with the dedicated funding for infrastructure improvements, which is critical. I changed the way the district appoints its members to the WMATA board. It always was, the mayor selected somebody, the council member was always on. And now I'm the one who's personally involved in selecting who's on the Metro board. I'm the one who nominated Lucinda Babers. I'm the one who nominated Tracy Haddon-Lowe, not a council member on the board. And I think we're getting better representation. We are struggling with the fact that Virginia, when it adopted the dedicated funding, put restrictions that I think were too severe on alternates participating. So basically, an alternate can be appointed by jurisdiction, but they can't attend the meetings. They're kind of left out in the dark, and then they have to come in and sit in for a regular member. If the regular member can't attend, it's crazy. We need to find a better balance. I've actually talked to our leadership in the Virginia legislature and representatives in the Maryland legislature about trying to address that so that we can get alternates who are well versed in issues so that we have better representation. There's legislation pending in the council right now that would encourage residents to use transit. There's been some report of it in the news. The basic outline is that every resident would get a $100 fare card. And if they use it during the month, then it gets replenished to $100 the next month. And that should incentivize more people to use transit. I think that the people who believe in transit and are anti-car make a mistake in being anti-car, because I think what we do is we make transit more attractive rather than make driving an automobile punitive. And we get people to choose to shift. Transit's critical because our roads and highways cannot handle everyone driving. We need public transit. And public transit is good in a number of ways. Environment, for example. So I feel like I'm rambling a bit here. I will say that personally, I think it's important that the district works with Maryland and Virginia. This is a regional transit system, and we need to make sure that it is a viable operation. It's been hurt by the pandemic, as we all know, and so we need to make sure that it gets out of the pandemic and is thriving.
Well, sir, you were not rambling. I think you were making several points, and all valid and good points. Is there any advice that you would give Randy Clark, the new general manager? Or do you want to keep that to yourself and just share it with him personally?
Well, I've met with him a couple of times. I'm not sure that I have advice to give him because I think he's pretty capable. And he's impressed people when he's met with them. But if I had to give him advice, it would be make sure that you spend a lot of time reaching out and getting to know and build relationships with regional players, because you're going to need them to support the system. And make sure that WMATA gets out of some of the hidebound bureaucracy that has held it back in the past. But I think he's got that figured out.
All right, fair enough. One of the things you talked about was that we need a public transportation system, and of course that impacts the environment. Can you talk to us about what the district's carbon reduction goals are and how it is navigating that transition to EV, and what are the cost implications?
We adopted legislation in 2018. If I remember correctly, it's called the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Amendment Act of 2018. It was somewhat controversial in the business sector, actually somewhat controversial in the environmental community because they thought it didn't go far enough. The environmental community didn't. I think it was maybe the most far-reaching, or for sure one of the most far-reaching pieces of legislation in the country. It would cut greenhouse emissions by 50% by 2032. I think that's 50% compared to 2006, although my notes don't say that. Ensure that all electricity purchased in the district be 100% renewable by 2032. By 2041, at least 10% of the energy must come from solar. Ensure that public transportation and fleet vehicles are electric by 2045. Since then, we've actually adopted a sense of the council expressing our desire for WMATA to speed its transition to electric buses. I have to say that while there's a lot of talk from the executive in the district about how excited they are with the federal infrastructure legislation and funding, about how we're going to get more EV infrastructure in the city, since I drive an EV vehicle, I don't think the city could move any slower. Maybe it could, but it's been pretty slow. There's really not a lot to study other than, for instance, for buses, what do you do with your routes that might be longer than what the range is for a bus during the day? Driving an EV vehicle, I can tell you, it's not rocket science. You need an electrical outlet to plug it in to charge it when the range gets down pretty low. But people act like somehow this is a mystery and we've got to do pilots and we've got to study this. And oh my God. And it's not that complicated. I've been pressing OSSE, the Office of State Superintendent of Education, to move more quickly to convert their bus fleet to EV vehicles. They were planning a pilot of 10. I hope I said pilot with some disdain. And
You did, sir.
recently got a grant that will enable them to buy an additional 20 EV buses. And I think they're going to discover that EV is not complicated. I went to the, I had to go take my car in the other day because there's been a recall on it. And I was reminded my service costs are zero. There's no oil to change. There's no radiator, cooling system, carburetor. There's none of that stuff. There's no maintenance on the vehicle other than wear and tear on the tires. And
Well, talk about that in terms of alternative energy sources along with alternative devices. How do you think the timeline for transition for the business community is going to go? Like you mentioned that the government is slow in doing this. So how do you think the larger business community is going to be able to transition to the adoption of alternative energy sources and, use of devices?
Well, where we're trying to go is we're trying to get through the Public Service Commission that the electricity supplied in the district, it comes from renewables. So the closer we get to that, the less the private sector has to figure out how to convert to renewables. There are some initiatives that do affect the business sector, and I think the government has to be mindful of, when I say government, the council needs to be mindful of striking the right balance so that we're pushing for change, but not pushing too fast for change. So we have the Green Building Act. Buildings are a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, and buildings need to be greener. To require that of buildings tomorrow is unreasonable. I think to require it of buildings in the year, let's say 2060, is unreasonable. But to push that transition is good for the environment and what the district can do in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. We are going to see, and I am some concerned about this, that we're seeing increasingly that there's attention to natural gas, as being not where we want to be in the long run in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But I think we have to ensure that there's an adequate time for transition. I mean, what I have seen is in the private sector, businesses have discovered that they don't have to stick with their traditional line. Ford and GM are all into converting to all electric vehicles, even though they've been gasoline powered for over a century. And I think that can be true for the utilities, but we need to have the right balance in terms of that transition.
Well, so we have a question from the audience, and I think your comments about having the right balance, I would have normally asked this question at the end, but it came in response to sometimes the council's pushing more aggressively. And there's a feeling and a sentiment that the council is increasingly less open to the significant concerns raised by the business community. Sometimes some of your colleagues appear to be downright hostile. What advice can you give us, for how do we prepare to work with this incoming council, to preserve and protect our local economy?
Well, two things. First, elections matter, and there's an election in 10 days, 8 days, actually 6 days. There's an election. Elections matter.
Ballot, sir.
So when the tax increase went through a couple of years ago, which I did not support, I remember commenting to folks at the time, this vote was lost not yesterday, it was lost 2 years earlier in the election. So that's the first thing I would say, is be involved in elections. And that's not a one-time thing. That's the election this year, election 2 years from now. The second thing is to build relationships. The folks who are more anti-business in the community have made much more of a presence for themselves at the Wilson Building than the business community. It used to be, and I'm speaking figuratively, that I couldn't walk into the Wilson Building without running into somebody representing the business community. That doesn't happen anymore. Again, I'm speaking figuratively because not that many people come into the Wilson Building these days, but now when I walk into the Wilson Building, I'm going to run into a couple of people, different people, who are pushing an anti-business agenda. Need to build more relationships and have more of a presence.
So just let me ask you, pivoting just a little bit to tourism and, elevating the business environment. Because I think to your point about having relationships, one of the things the question sort of sparked in my mind, this notion that maybe members of the council don't really understand or see the business community as integral. So tourism is one of the major sources of revenue in the District of Columbia, and it provides funding for various programs. How's tourism in our city doing in compared to pre-pandemic levels, and how is this going to affect the city in terms of its long-term budget?
Well, thankfully, it was only a week ago that we got a briefing from Destination DC. So this is a little bit fresh in my mind. The tourism business has rebounded much more than I would have thought. If you talk to Elliot Ferguson, he's going to tell you yes, but there's more money to be made from international visitors than from domestic visitors. And where we've seen most of the rebound has been with the domestic visitors. So it's great that things are recovering, but there's much more that we need. My notes here say that hotel occupancy rates in September were 10% below 2019 levels. I mean, there are two ways of looking at that. At least we're recovering, and it's still not where it was 3 years ago, let alone the growth that we would like to see year after year. Destination DC briefed us on this because they would like us to adopt a short-term additional, they call it an assessment, create a tourism recovery district downtown that would add 1% on top of the current hotel tax rate for 3 to 4 years. And that would generate, I think it's close to $21 million annually for advertising to promote tourism and overnight stays. I'm supportive of that, although I asked the first question at the presentation, and that was, do you trust us that we'll repeal it after 3 to 4 years? And I think that's important here, is that we make a deal that we'll do this, but that it will then sunset. Over the years, I have pushed to put money in the budget to get more money to Destination DC, as well as to Events DC for promotion. But Destination DC does more of the nationwide as well as international advertising. And interestingly, I've had resistance from, in the past, from the executive and other council members. I think we, the council, need to be all in and supporting our hospitality industry, because that is a major generator of revenue, tax revenue.
So talking about tax revenue, the Tax Revision Commission is at its work. What are you hoping will come out of, or what's the goal of the Tax Revision Commission? What are you hoping the end result will be? And do you think that its recommendations, how hard will it be to sell the recommendations? You mentioned the high income earner tax, and I'll ask you a follow-up question about that.
Well, you know, the way every government approaches taxes is on a piecemeal basis. So we'll raise a tax this year, maybe we'll cut a tax next year. This council really isn't into cutting taxes. But I think of other jurisdictions that are busy cutting taxes and being more not to do so, because of the recession, they're going to need the revenue that they're losing. But we do taxes on a piecemeal basis. That's not good. And we tend to do it either because we need something or because there's some policy where we want to pursue. The tax increase a couple of years ago was to pursue the policy of equity. And I have to say, because it was sort of a one-off, it really wasn't looking at the tax code comprehensively in terms of equity. So that's one of the things that I hope the Tax Revision Commission will do. And what does equity mean? Equity means, I think what it means in the context of taxes is that lower income people pay a lower share of their taxes. We're pretty much there with our income tax because of the recommendations of the last Tax Revision Commission. But we're not there in terms of our overall tax burden. I don't know if we can get there in terms of being truly progressive, that is, low income pay a smaller share. Because when you look at the entire tax burden, you're talking about sales tax, which will forever be regressive and is an important part of our tax base. And you're looking at real property tax, which is somewhat progressive, but it's kind of hard to make that more progressive. So it's pretty much income tax. But in any event, I think it's a worthy goal to look at our tax structure where lower income pay a lower share, and lower income also could include smaller businesses, you know, low income businesses. That's one thing. Another thing is that another goal is to be mindful of competitiveness. And there's a lot that's anecdotal about that. And I remember that the previous Tax Revision Commission did some studies and found that people weren't relocating because of taxes. And yet anecdotally, you hear that all the time. So I want the Tax Commission to look at that again and really carefully analyze to what extent we need to adjust our taxes to be competitive, the district competitive with the region. I'm kind of blanking on other goals here. Ease of administration. So oftentimes there are a lot of ideas and taxes that really sound good and they get complicated real fast. And if they get complicated, they can't be administered easily, or it's easy for people to cheat. Those are not good taxes if they're hard to administer. And then just looking at our tax code comprehensively, the whole thing. And how many taxes do businesses pay? Because there's a gross receipts tax. I think there's a baseball tax. There's the franchise tax. There's the real property tax. Let's kind of sort through that. And do we need all those taxes, or is there a way of simplifying that? My view generally about taxes is I think the most important aspect of taxes is stability. So people may not have liked it when we raised the franchise tax rate to whatever it is right now, but they're used to it, and they've been paying that for years. When we increase it, that creates instability. That's not a good thing. People would be happy if we lower it, and I don't have a problem with lowering taxes. But the most important aspect of taxes, I think, is stability. What you're paying this year is what you're paying next year. Instead of this uncertainty that, gosh, they're just going to keep raising my taxes.
Well, one of the things you mentioned, the high income earner tax that was enacted by the council in last year's budget, and you were one of the most vocal opponents to it. And as I think I recall you saying that we should not be raising taxes in a time when we don't actually need the money. And anecdotally, we've learned that high income residents have started to leave the city. I can tell you candidly, 4 of my partners have moved to either Maryland or Virginia. So what do you think is going to actually happen in this tax cycle? Do you think that we're going to see a reduction in that number of high income earners who could have been taxed? Or do you think that that revenue is going to be realized and, everyone will sort of, as you said, get used to it because it's now what they will expect to pay?
Well, we created damage with the tax increase by creating this instability and this notion that the council is just going to keep taxing. That's slowly calming down because we didn't raise taxes this year, and my sense, not promise, my sense is that we're not going to raise taxes next year. And I don't think the Tax Revision Commission is going to come in with something that's going to just unsettle everybody. Maybe it'll make some adjustments to the income tax, but then to the sales tax and then to the real property tax. And as a package, I don't know that it will be unsettling, but I don't know. There was more to your question that I didn't answer.
Well, it was just the expectation of whether or not the revenue projected for the high income earner tax will be actually realized at the levels that were projected by the CFO. You may not, have a sense of that right now.
Well, the revenue estimates, the last several revenue estimates have shown growth in our income tax. And if I remember correctly, growth exceeding estimates.
Okay.
So, I mean, this also speaks to another problem, and that is the council is, I have colleagues who are just simply unwilling to cut and unwilling to look at, well, I'll give an example. So I have oversight over the schools, DCPS, and I very much want to see public education improve. And so I'm looking to try to stop the cuts to local individual schools get, stabilize their budgets. The executive came in and testified, oh, this is going to break the bank. It's going to require us to put much more money in. My view is look at central administration, look at the central offices and see if you can't fund this from within DCPS rather than saying we have to spend more. In other words, realigning how we're spending money. And that's what my colleagues are unwilling to do. Our budget has gone in the last few years from something like 16 or maybe it was $14 billion to 19 billion. That's a lot of billions.
That is.
And yet we're not doing job training any better. For example, I can't say the DOES is functioning better in terms of the programmatic results than before when we had less money. So is really spending more money the answer, or is it figuring out how to realign what we're spending money on to get better results?
Well, that's going to lead us to a question from one of the audience members, and in particular, you called out public education. What are your thoughts on the upcoming school rate adequacy study? My child attends St. Coletta, a public charter school serving students with significant and multiple disabilities. Mr. Chairman, have at it.
What was the first part of that?
What are your thoughts on the upcoming, I'm reading it as I've got it. What are your thoughts on the upcoming school rate adequacy study? The person who asked the question, their child attends St. Coletta.
Yes. Well, the adequacy study is something that was done about 10 years ago, and it's going to be done again this year. I put that in the budget. I want to see a new adequacy study. It looks at the uniform per pupil formula. That's how we fund the school systems, whether it's DCPS or let's say KIPP, which has a number of campuses. Those are called LEAs or local education agencies. And that's how we ensure some fairness between the LEAs. We fund on a per pupil basis. And we don't just simply fund on the basis of a kid is worth 10,000. You have so many kids, that's so many times 10,000. Rather, we say that elementary schools cost a certain amount and high schoolers cost a different amount. And if you have special education needs, then there's an additional amount. And so it gets complicated real fast. And the adequacy study is looking at those different, I didn't call them anything. Formulas, we actually call them weights. So a student is the foundation and then you add weights to it. If they're at risk, you add a weight. If they're special ed, you add a weight. If it's high school, you add a weight. And the adequacy study is looking at whether those weights are what they should be. So if we say that a high schooler costs $1,000 a year more than an elementary school student, maybe 1,000 is the wrong amount. Maybe it should be 800, maybe it should be 1,500, and that's what the adequacy study will look at. It's probably going to say that we're not funding the kids enough, which will be a pressure then to put more money in the budget for schools. I don't know that that's a horrible thing because I think public education is really important. What I think is, what I'm critical of is that we're not getting the results that we should be getting with our public education dollars. When, this is not an accurate number, but when 50% of our kids are testing below proficient, we're not doing as good a job as we should do. And that's, to me, that's where the criticism is how do we improve educational outcomes?
Well, Mr. Chairman, let me ask a question. Is it that we need more money to improve the outcomes? Or, I mean, maybe it's the programming, like to your point, you mentioned earlier about, we spend a lot of money in government, but we're not necessarily getting the results that we want to see. And you, specifically the district's budget, as you said, has grown. We're $19 billion, almost $19 billion, I think. So do we need to add more money, or do we need to look critically at how the money is being used? I mean, I remember when I worked for you, that you held oversight hearings and you would hold monthly oversight hearings on an agency to drive a result. And, in particular, I think about driving down overtime at the fire department. One of the things that you did, and you did that every month, you held a hearing with Chief Rubin and asked him the exact same questions and forced him to really go back and look at how the department was operating. So is it more money that's necessary, or does the council need to take a more critical role or take its oversight responsibilities more seriously to figure out if the programming that's being offered is really working as it should?
Well, I start with programming and oversight. Now, it could be that depending upon the agency or the issue that more money will be needed, but I start with programming and oversight. If DOES has a job training program and we actually looked at the data, which I'm not sure we do, I'm not even sure we have the data, and saw that 5% of the people who go through that program, job training program, get a decent job that they keep for 5 years, then I don't know. I don't think the first answer to me is not, well, let's put more money into it. The first answer is let's restructure the program or maybe abandon the program and find a different approach that is more effective. I'd say the same thing with schools. Improving attendance, in my view, doesn't require more dollars. Reducing teacher turnover, I don't think requires more dollars. I said that a little differently because maybe there needs to be more professional development, which might cost PD for teachers. We just had a hearing on teacher turnover, and the One of the factors that's contributing to teacher turnover right now, well, the greatest factor contributing to teacher turnover is dissatisfaction. And the dissatisfaction is coming from several places, one of which is just the pressures of the pandemic and the lingering pressures of there's more being put on teachers, and they feel like they're getting dumped on. They're not getting any relief or any help. But also DCPS HR department right now is a mess. I have a good friend who retired this year. She put in her retirement papers last, I think she said April. She has yet to get her first retirement check. HR. Well, HR doesn't require more money. It requires better management. So I start with looking at the programming and looking at an oversight. And only if that leads in the direction of more money would I go there.
Okay, fair enough. One of the things that's top of mind for most people now is crime. Can you talk to us about sort of does the perception that crime is on the increase, is that belied in the stats? And what do you think DC can do to make residents either change their perceptions or, really just sort of improve the perception of how people may be feeling unsafe in this post-pandemic world?
Well, I would begin by saying it's belied in the stats, and I'm trying to see if I can pull up the today's statistics, and this will probably take me a minute. Oh, that's great. Today's crime table was not generated. Okay, never mind.
We'll talk about yesterday.
Yeah, the chief made a presentation a week ago to the council, and the statistics are surprising. It's different than what the perception is. But my view is, when it comes to public safety, perception is probably the most important thing. So I'm not going to agree with you that there have been more murders this year than last year, because the statistics don't bear that out. But the fact that people are feeling unsafe about shootings and murders, that's a big deal. And I think that more attention needs to be given to MPD closing more cases. It's been a few months since I looked at this, but last year, only about 50% of the homicides that were committed last year were closed last year. Only about 25% of the robberies that occurred last year were closed last year. Close more cases. And that's not just as simple as, oh, go close more cases. What do the police need to close more cases? In the news yesterday, there was something about the U.S. attorney looking at some of the prosecutions that involve some police officers who apparently were violating police requirements when they confiscated guns and not making arrests. Well, if you have cops who have ruined their credibility, then it's going to be hard to close cases with prosecutions. So that's just one way of closing more cases. But are there enough detectives? What's the caseload per detective? One of the factors in closing cases is that it's hard to get witnesses. I asked the chief when I meet with him every month. There was a mass shooting 2 years ago, I think, on Dubois Place in Southeast. There were like 10 different shooters involved. It was like a neighborhood block party. They have only they have a suspect, but they only have one witness. They only have one witness. This was a neighborhood block party that got shot up. And there's only one witness. There was a shooting across the street from where I live between two football teams that were playing on a rec field. Now, when you're playing sports, you know who the other people are. And this one guy got mad at another guy and shot him 10 times, killed him, and there were no witnesses. That's a problem. That's a function of people trusting the police. So improving community relations, getting more people to testify. When Kathy Lanier became chief, this was one of her priorities, was to improve trust. I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing the police, but what I'm trying to convey is that there are strategies to increase the case closure rate. And that would go a long way toward reducing a lot of these crimes.
Or the perception that there's a prevalence of crime, I suspect too. If you close, the increasing closure rate says, you know, it gives a sense of security.
Yes, but also if you increase the closure, there'll be fewer crimes. Most of our crimes are committed by repeat offenders. If I remember correctly, one of the guys who shot up Tyson's Mall a few months ago was one of the suspects in that Dubois place. They haven't solved the case at Dubois place, but right now one of the suspects is locked up. So closing a case and arresting somebody probably prevents a bunch more cases. That's my point here.
All right, we're going to pivot back to transportation. So next Wednesday is the Capital Region Transportation Forum that will bring together transportation secretaries from Maryland, Virginia, and DC, and as well as the head of WMATA. As our region is projected for so much growth in the coming decades, how would you like to see our region work better together on transportation issues, especially from the district's perspective?
Well, I've been very involved with the Council of Governments, as you noted earlier, and I used to be on the Transportation Planning Board. A lot of our transportation work is done on a regional basis, and I think that's very important. There needs to be more of that. Don't have a criticism there, but when I say there needs to be more of it, but I think that's a way to help with transportation. And we make a mistake if we look at it in isolation.
Right.
I don't know if that completely answered your question.
No, I think it does. I think what you're sharing with everyone is that right now we do, you know, work cooperatively together, and we could certainly do more, but that just really requires us to do more. And maybe the summit next week, Wednesday, is going to facilitate that.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about the federal midterm elections and potential House bills that will limit the district's autonomy. They're likely to resurface again. And, you know, given the expectations that Congress will shift to a Republican majority, what do you think we can do? What mitigations or strategies are being developed to protect the district's home rule?
It's kind of hard to do something proactively in that sphere.
I think you're going to have to explain why.
Well, yeah, I think I'm struggling with exactly how to articulate this. But for one thing, there's speculation right now that the House and Senate will flip. But let's just say it will. Who's going to be in charge of the committee that has oversight of the district in the House and who in the Senate? If the person is really hostile, that's one set of strategies that we'll have to follow. If the person isn't so hostile, then it's another set of strategies. We don't know exactly where they're going to be hostile. We have budget autonomy. And so even though Congress makes a big deal of passing our appropriation, the reality is that once the council passes the budget and it goes through the 30-day congressional layover, we have a budget. So they can't really shut us down. They will probably, if the majorities flip, they probably will do some things that are hostile. They may go after the DC tag money. Well, then we'll have to, and that's tuition assistance grant program. Then we'll have to fight to keep the dollars for tuition assistance, which we've been able to do for at least 2 decades with Republican majorities and Democratic majorities. I think it's less likely that we'll get a statehood bill through, but I know there's been talk, there've been a couple of extreme Republicans who've talked about getting rid of home rule. They don't know what they're asking for. And I think that their colleagues will have a sense that what they're asking for is not what they want. Running the district government is a big enterprise. I was recently looking at, there's a bill that we marked up yesterday regarding engineer licensure.
Yep.
It was written by Congress in 1950. I mean, think of this. The national legislature is spending time figuring out how to license engineers in the district. They don't have time for that. And so Congress is going to just go whole hog forward with repealing home rule because somebody who's a bit extreme recommended it. I don't think so. I feel like I'm rambling here again, but the point is that we don't know exactly what proposals there will be. And so it's kind of hard to figure out how to be proactive, other than, of course, building relationships and being there to answer questions for those who don't understand.
Well, have you been up on the Hill? Have you, are you meeting with some of the Republicans and talking to them about the district? Or would you rather not say?
Well, I'll be honest, I have not done as much of that as I think I should. And I will have to do more of that next year. I can tell you that when the Republicans were in control, I think it was in 2018, I was up there all the time, and Congressman Issa said to me at one point that I was far more responsive than and cooperative than the executive branch. I'm not interested in having a fight with Congress. I'm interested in explaining to them why they should recognize that we're actually doing a pretty good job here.
Fair enough. So what are your priorities for 2023? And you want to tell us how you're going to, dole out committee assignments?
Okay, so you want me to get my list, share my list here of who the committee?
You should, and we will all take notes right now. Or just what are your priorities for
No,
2023?
just say it's off the record and then I can share all of it with you.
Oh, it's off the record, sir.
Well, actually, I'm waiting for the election. As you know, there are two council members who are running against each other for the at-large slot, Kenya McDuffie and Alyssa Silverman. And so I'm waiting for the election, and then I will sit down with members and talk with them about the council structure for next year. The council structure is probably going to be less business friendly than the current structure, but we already know that because we already know that we've got two new members, Ward 3 and Ward 5. And there's really not much I can do about that. It's what I said earlier. Elections make a difference. What I do want to see is that the council is better with oversight over housing, better with oversight over health. I very much want to continue the oversight that we've had over the past couple of years with public education. There will be a change in the oversight regarding environment, and that affects public safety, the Public Service Commission as well. I have not sorted that through. But I am mindful that the Public Service Commission is about regulating the utilities, regulating businesses, and the Department of Environment is about protecting the environment, which is a different mission. And so they don't necessarily go together, even though some people argue that they do. So I don't know that I can say more until I've talked to members, and after I talk to members, I'll put together a proposal and probably won't say anything about the proposal until I release it to the public.
Fair enough. So your priorities for 2023, policy priorities.
Well, I know that the biggest concerns in the community are affordable housing and public safety. And I am hopeful that we will continue with, there was a pendulum that moved when George Floyd was murdered, it was less friendly to traditional policing, and it seems to be moving back. And I'm hopeful it will continue to move back. Police accountability is super, super important. And police training is super, super important. And having police is also super, super important. So I'm hopeful that next year we will see more progress with public safety. Every year with the budget, I make sure that there's more funding than what the mayor proposes with regard to housing and affordable housing. And I will just say that in terms of the business community, I am concerned that there are strategies that in the name of affordable housing, like expanding rent control, that really are not as effective in terms of affordable housing. So let's look at other strategies. And that's what I hope will happen next year, is that rather than just get everybody in a lather over rent control, that we look at other ways to deal with and get more housing and affordable housing. And I always say both, because it's marketplace housing to meet the demand from those who can afford it, as well as affordable housing to meet the shortage of affordable housing in the city. And
I'm going to stop you there, Mr.
What's that?
I'm going to stop you there because we are at time.
So,
Oh, okay. You want to just, I think you may have a 10 o'clock meeting. So
yes, I do. Well, and the other thing is a priority that I have is education. That because that's a long-term strategy. That's a long-term strategy to deal not only with the employment sector, as I said before, job training, but to deal with our social justice issues.
all right. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to thank you for your time this morning. I think everyone found it enlightening, and they appreciate you taking time from your busy schedule, not just being the chairman of the council, but also this is an election year for you. And, you know, you are down to the last 6 days. So we are going to thank you for your time this morning, and we enjoyed the conversation. And as always, Phil, it's a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Janine. And
Well,
I appreciated this opportunity.
thanks. And Jack, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
That's great. Thanks, Janine. Really appreciate you moderating our conversation this morning. Chairman Mendelson, thank you. Appreciate your insights. There's a lot of work to do. We look forward to working with you on those. And thank you, everyone, for attending today. Much appreciated taking the time to spend with us. I also want to thank our sponsors today, Holland & Knight, Comcast, GS Proctor & Associates, McGuire Woods Consulting, and McGuire Woods for making the 2022 Regional Policy Leadership happen. And I know there was a question, the Capital Region Transportation Forum that Janine mentioned, that's next week on November 9th. And if you'd like more information about that, you can find it on our website. So just go to bot.org. There's more information there. So there'll be a lot coming out of that as well. With that, I want to thank you all again. Much appreciated, and have a great day. Take care.
Thank you all.